Welcome back, everyone, to our fourth session in Series 2 of the Decolonization Learning Journey. My name is Nicole Cameron, and I'm very fortunate to live in Unama'ki in Cape Breton Island, or the land of the fog. I'm the Director of Operations and Special Projects for the Community Sector Council of Nova Scotia, and I'm very honored to work with our partners at Unama'ki College and my fellow hosts, Elder Jane Meter and Mary Beth Doucette. We're also very honored to welcome Denise Pictou Maloney today. We're looking forward to hearing more from her shortly. Before we get started, I would like to go over just a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Many of you are here for the second, third, fourth, maybe sixth or seventh time, and we welcome each and every one of you. First thing I'd like to say is that there may be some content in today's talk that deals with some very difficult truths of Canada's past and our present, and we encourage you to participate with a loved one or a support person, as these stories may be traumatizing to some listeners. Please do take care of yourself, knowing that you can come back and listen to the recorded webinar at a later date, or you can check out and then come back to the live session. We do have a document uploaded. If you're in your control panel in the GoToWebinar control panel, if you click down under handouts, you'll see a handout that says webinar supports for viewers. And there's a number of different phone numbers and organizations that certainly you can reach out to directly for further support, either during the session or following the session or in weeks to come. Denise will also speak to this a little more fully in her conversation with us today. So when you join today's webinar, you likely notice that you're in listen-only mode. We do this to minimize background noise and to keep our attention on our guest today, Denise. Also, when you join, you selected to either join by phone call or computer audio. We will be showing a YouTube video, so it is best if you have the ability to use the computer's speakers. And lastly, the video that we'll show today, when you see the recording, you'll note that there'll be a spot for the YouTube video, but it won't actually play back. So we do send that link out separately, so you'll actually have to switch platforms, and this is due to YouTube's copyright laws. And lastly, again, just drawing your attention over to the control panel in GoToWebinar, there is a spot for questions. So if you click on the little arrow, you'll see a chat box area that you can submit your questions that we will try to get to towards the end of our conversation with Denise today. Please know that we probably can't get to all of your questions. We do try to curate them, and Mary Beth will be moderating the session with Denise and Jane towards the end. That question box is also for tech, so if you're having any issues at all, you can pop your question in there, and Alexandra, who works with Community Sector Council, will be sure to get back to you in the dialogue box so we can sort out your text so you can listen more fully. So before we get started, I wanted to just say a few words about this journey. As we continue to go deeper into our unlearning and our learning journey, I want to say that this series is an ongoing call and an invitation to you as individuals and as organizations to feel and be fully in the shift that we are called to, or that we're being called to. This work has the potential of being deeply transformational, both on the personal and the societal levels, if we create the space to do so. It calls us into a spiral-shaped journey where we have the opportunity to examine our own lives and our thinking, our own narrative, while also the outer journey of thinking and being and acting in new and wise ways in our work through our organizations. In both of these interconnected journeys toward decolonization and reconciliation, it takes our deep presence, our full hearts, our full minds, and our full will to grow into true and humble allies. And it calls us to listen with fresh ears and new eyes. And that said, before we can see with new eyes, we must listen. So we hear and we understand the pain Indigenous people have been feeling for centuries of repression and violence. And today we have the honor and the privilege to be in this space of deep listening with Denise Pictou Maloney. We thank you so much, Denise, for opening your heart to share your story and to share your work around the National Inquiry for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. As we wrapped up our session last week with Elder Albert Marshall and Medina Fort, Jane Meter invited us to think about gratitude. I think, as she said, it takes an attitude of gratitude. And as we wrap up our Thanksgiving Day weekend and our celebrations, I imagine for each of us, it's easy to carry in the thanks that we were feeling over the weekend into our work weeks. So I just want to invite us into a space of opening our hearts and becoming fully present for everyone on the call, and in particular to Denise today. So what I'm going to do is just lead you through a very short centering. Really want to invite you into this sacred space that we can honor Denise's story and we can be fully present for her. So I do invite you to sit or stand in such a way that your feet are touching the ground. So just adjusting yourself for a moment, letting go of your mouse, perhaps closing any apps that you might have open, closing your office door, whatever it is to help minimize any distraction. And just feeling your feet flat on the earth, imagining your feet reaching right down into the earth, feeling supported and held and grounded. And as you start to feel that groundedness, I also invite you to take 2 or 3 full deep breaths in and out. You may like to have your hands on your heart or even on your lap or down at your side, somewhere where they're comfortable. But just inviting a deep breath in, and letting it go as you start to settle your mind, letting go of your work this morning, letting go of your to-do lists, knowing that it's all there for you after, but to create this space to open. So with each exhale, feeling more and more openness, coming into a quiet space to offer your presence, your love, and your support to Denise, to Elder Jane Meter, to Mary Beth, and to everyone on this decolonization learning journey. And as you settle into this space, I also invite you to call to mind a thought or two around what you're feeling grateful for today as we enter this journey. And so without overthinking or without forcing anything to arise, and just breathe in to what you're feeling. Just breathe into that sense of gratitude. Just creating that space of silence for a moment. Just notice. Now I invite you with your next exhale to just let go of that thought around gratitude, but hold on to the feeling phone. As we start now to shift over into a more official opening of today's session, so I invite Mary Beth and Elder Jane Meter to open our journey today more fully.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all virtually to this place through the magic of the internet to Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship which the Mi'kmaq and Molossioc people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Molossioc title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And with that, welcome. And Elder Jane Meter is going to open us with some good words.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Nicole and Denise. Welcome. Isok, Denise Kamijina, Kugamijina, Asa Hawegi. Muwalo Uchidulana, Ahada Molek, at Waving Kisco. Siaw Yabahon Muye. Yes, Waskumkachi, Ahaganama Hachi, Tigik, Skijino, Iganamuyeg and Sedwahan. Aksasadi, Amogi Gnodi. Clamantandesi, Isisiawatisen, Akisluvatisen, Onung to Mordahan. Abon Muyek, Wejidunen, what the Hodi Ulav Sit Hamu, Amsidnogama. Creator, grandfathers, grandmothers, and ancestors, we are grateful to you for this day, and we ask that you be with us today. We humbly ask for your assistance as we address and teach other people. Grant us wisdom, love, and strength so that we can all continue to do our work together in a careful and proper manner in promoting Indigenous matters or concerns, especially when advancing and fostering peace on our mother, the earth. All my relations.
Okay, thank you, Jane. So I guess I'm looking at my agenda and it says provide some contextualization, but I think we have a plan for that and Denise has a plan for that. So I'm not going to say anything else at this point before I introduce Denise, but Jane, did you have anything you wanted to say before we get started? No? Okay. All right, so it is our great privilege today to have Denise Pictou Maloney with us. Denise was born in Boston, Massachusetts in the US and moved to Nova Scotia when she was 9 years old. She's a member of the Sebeganegedy First Nation and was raised just outside of Jibuktuk, which is Halifax, and she maintains a strong familial connections to several Indigenous communities in Mi'kma'ki. Denise was raised with a strong work ethic based in traditional protocol, morals, human rights, and deep respect for her inherent connection to land and water. At a young age, Denise and her sister suffered the loss of their mother under tragic circumstances that has left an intergenerational impact on her family. After high school graduation, Denise went on to university and studied in the fields of microbiology, sociology, and psychology. Before completion of her degree, she was blessed with the birth of her children and made the difficult decision to put her education on hold to prioritize the raising of her two children while fostering their Mi'kmaq identity and education. Denise has campaigned for over 20 years for her mother's justice during 4 trials that lasted 10 years and often speaks publicly about her family's journey. She's an advocate for Indigenous women's human rights and has spoken on behalf of her mother at the United Nations, civil rights conferences, journalist conferences, and American colleges and universities to bring awareness to the injustices of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And she, to bring awareness to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and also how that has shaped and inspired her to help others to stand and take ownership of their lives. Denise has been employed by the Halifax Regional Center for Education in some capacity for almost 15 years, and most recently was employed as the Mi'kmaq Indigenous Student Support Worker for the Halifax region. She took a 2-year leave to answer the call to work for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The National Inquiry's mandate was to make recommendations, calls to justice, based on examining and reporting on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada through its guiding principles that included a decolonized, trauma-informed, families-first approach based in human rights and justice. Denise, thank you so much for joining us in this platform today, and we sincerely appreciate your willingness to share your wisdom and experiences with us. And I think Alexandra is going to bring up your video now.
Thank you.
Denise, I'm sorry to interrupt your microphone.
Now, good. Okay. Thank you, first of all, for all of you for joining us today. My intent today is to take you on a little bit of a journey that may be a little different than what you've experienced before in discussing matters of MMIWG. What I'll first do, and just kind of give you a framework of what to expect, because I like people to be prepared, is we'll first talk about what MMIWG is. We'll discuss what this entity is. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I became part of this entity through no choice of my own, obviously. And then what happened to our family in our quest for justice, the journey that we went on that does, yes, cover close to almost over 40 years. We're looking at 50 coming up soon since she left us. And then I'll talk a little bit about my time with the National Inquiry in the role that I had for 2.5 years in supporting families and helping facilitate that process. The result of it with the final report, which I will share a little PowerPoint slide, just so I'm not having to read, because it is all in legal language, or as I call the colonizers, language. I like to speak in more inclusive terms. You won't hear me using a lot of big terminology because I think it's important when you're discussing these things to talk about the simple things in life, because really, as big as we can manifest our causes and our issues, it really comes down to one thing: our life, our living being, our right to be here as living human beings. And that you really can't explain that in the colonizers' words if you're going to look at it from a traditional sense, and includes our inherent right to be here and to be included and to have space to do that. I'll talk a little bit about the systemic issues that our family experienced, which were very similar to what a lot of families experienced in their journey in trying to find justice. And then I believe we'll have an opportunity to do questions afterwards. So we'll start off with the beginning. What is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? I can't say that it's a movement, because it's not a movement. It's sacred work. It's representative of lives, of human beings that were at one point not considered valuable. It's a living, breathing entity that still takes lives every day. So it's not something that's in the past. It's current. It's happening. Every day we lose women and girls in some form. And it's far-reaching. Piggybacks is intersectionally connected to residential school survivors, 60 Scoop survivors, Indian Day school survivors. All of it is connected. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that people have in understanding what missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is about. It's the symptom. It's the symptom. And if you look at the word symptom, Oxford Dictionary defines it as the existence of something, a disease, especially often of an undesirable situation. When you look at disease, it's any harmful deviation from the normal structural or functional state of an organism. So what we're seeing and what we're witnessing here is the symptom of hundreds of years of oppression and colonial genocide, that is, and cultural genocide that has been enforced onto our First Nations in this continent. And I don't like to say country, because I don't believe in borders. I was traditionally raised in the very little short time that I was with my mom, and I had elders and family around me that has maintained that education to a certain level. I still have a lot to learn, losing your mother at a very young age. I don't have my language. I don't have my traditional cultural practices, but I understand my place in the universe, and I understand my inherent rights. She was able to instill those into me at a very young age. So you'll hear me talking a lot about space, reclaiming space, reclaiming power, bringing dignity back to our women and our girls. And what Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls does is it represents the disproportionate numbers that our women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA people have survived or succumbed to, experiencing all levels of violence in our world and in our existence. And it goes back far. It's not since 1984, which I believe, which is what a lot of the reports start doing their data from. So I guess the best place for me to start is to talk a little bit about my mom and my family's journey. As you saw in the video, my mother was a staunch advocate for women's rights, for Indigenous rights. She was an activist that in the 70s, you know, being educated traditionally, raised traditionally, she had that spirit and knowledge that of how things used to be, and knew that currently the way our society was going was not supporting our First Nations, and certainly wasn't supporting our survival. And she took it upon herself to become involved with an organization that ended up, unfortunately, not following through with what their promises and what their mandates were when they first started out in their inception. So the earliest memory I have of my mom was in our apartment in Boston, where she had gotten down on her knees and was explaining to me about an event that was happening in a place called Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where, and this would have been in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And she was explaining that there was a group called the American Indian Movement that had come into Boston, and where she worked at the Boston Indian Council, and had said that they were recruiting for members to come to start, you know, bringing awareness and to start protesting, and basically going out on the road to help people who couldn't help themselves, to stand up for those that didn't have a voice, and to protest against the injustices that, you know, they were all living in, racism, which, you know, is not something that I can talk in the past of as of late, with everything going on in our world. But that was the climate then. And at one point when I used to tell this story, I used to be able to say, you know, back in the 70s when everybody was really, you know, there were a lot of racial tones and nuances, and I can't say that anymore, sadly, but we'll get to that later. So she said that she had wanted to start working with this group, and you know, what she instilled in me at a very young age was my human rights and my Indigenous rights, you know, and sadly I was aware at a very young age of racism because of her experiences, and because I lived in a metropolis. You know, I lived in Boston. I was downtown Boston in the South Side, you know, South Boston, and you know, there was a lot of multicultural groups living there, but there was also still a lot of racism. And when the American Indian Movement came, I think one of the earliest protests we went to was the taking over of the Mayflower, actually during Thanksgiving weekend. You know, she joined the group, and we drove and caravanned to Plymouth Rock, where the ship sits, and they took over the ship, and you know, there was media there and pictures, and we were kind of kept off to one side to stay safe. That was one thing that she was always very aware of, was our safety, but also very much along the lines of, when we protest now, you see a lot of people bringing their families, because this is part of their legacy. They bring their children, you know, obviously not if it's going to be dangerous and harmful to their health, but this was something that my mother believed we should witness, because not to see and not to be part of that, to her, was a disservice to us in carrying our legacy on and making sure that we fought for our rights, so that we could all have a better future together. The sad thing about the group, the American Indian Movement, is when my mom joined it, they were great talkers of what they wanted to accomplish and how they wanted to reinstill our traditional ways and bring back our cultural traditional sun dances and practices, and really returning to our traditional ways to try and realign our First Nations in trying to overcome a lot of the systemic racism and issues that they were suffering, as a way to protect ourselves, as a way to give us some hope. But the problem was that a lot of the men who started up the American Indian Movement were ex-cons, and it was actually born inside a prison, the idea of the American Indian Movement. And with that, unfortunately, came a lot of their toxicity and behaviors that ended up becoming issues in the group, moral and ethical issues in how they behaved in treating their women, in drug use before Sundance, alcohol use before ceremony, beating other women. My mother would have had issues with that, and it spoke often of how she would get in the middle between a partner and his spouse or her spouse when fists were flying, and trying to express that this was not the way, we should be treating each other. Not to say that she wasn't able to defend herself, herself, but still, the intent was to try to represent something different than what was already out there, with the violence that a lot of our women and girls and men and boys were experiencing and living and existing in. So in 1973, she got the call to go down to Wounded Knee. And if a lot of you on here don't know what Wounded Knee it was a 71-day standoff in Wounded Knee, South Dakota, that took place in 1973. I believe it was April 1973, to protest the illegal selling off of large tracts of land for uranium mining. To the public, it was shared that, the government was selling off large tracts of land without consulting the First Nation. In reality, on the ground, what it was is that it was the tribal government that was in backroom deals with the federal government to sell off large tracts of land. Grassroots people had an issue with that, so they protested. The tribal government rose up, and there were lots of deaths. If any of you have ever seen the movie Thunderheart, and that movie about uranium mining, and there was a woman in there, I think, that they find murdered out in the desert face down at the end of it. That's supposed to be my mother. That whole process of the infighting that happened in that community became national attention when the government had to send in the military to help diffuse the situation. And what that ended up meaning for the American Indian Movement was to show up and grandstand and take over and do things that I won't speak of today because we're short on time, but I welcome anyone that wants to know the real story of actually what happened during those 71 days. And it wasn't pretty. People lost their houses, lost their pets, lost their horse pets, because these guys came in and pretty much pillaged and burned their village, out of protest. Was not welcomed by all in the community. But again, this is what happens when there's no consultation and people get into the middle of other people's business. My mother at the time, trying to keep her own footing in terms of her moral and ethical code, and seeing all of this, witnessing all of this, protested the behavior and was labeled right away a troublemaker by some of the men. Some of the women didn't like her because she was from another community. And paranoia and racism, became the validation of why these people could lose their lives and not have any consequences. My mother wasn't the only one that died during that era of the 70s. There were several lives lost, and there were 5 unmarked graves in Wounded Knee to this day, that were people that went in to help and didn't come out, that were not killed by the FBI or killed by the government. They were killed by people that were in Wounded Knee. whoever did that could obviously make their own. I'm not here to make accusations, but they never went home. And one of them was a Black activist by the name of Perry Ray Robinson. And I've got a lot of information on my website for people that want it. That's a very important story, because his experience was very similar to my mother's. So in 1973, with all of this going on, my mom had left us in the care of her sister, my auntie, and my mother and father, who were separated at the time, had an agreement that whoever was in the best capability, the best space to look after us, would have custody of us. So after her activities with the Wounded Knee takeover, she was put on the FBI's one of the top 10 most wanted lists. And my dad at the time had said, you know, that was not something he felt comfortable with. So he came down to the States and picked us up and brought us back to Nova Scotia. I would have been 10 at that time, almost 10. And, you know, after that settled down, we really didn't hear too much from my mom other than her calling us and sending us letters. And she agreed with my dad while this was all going on until it settled down that it was best that we stayed with her. But the intent was that we were going to go back and live with her after she was settled with everything that had happened. And I think it was August or September of 1975 was the last time I remember seeing my mother. And at that time, she had shared with my aunties that the group, the American Indian Movement members, were interrogating her. Certain members felt that her questions weren't appreciated. And one of the interrogations that she went through was with a man by the name of Leonard Peltier. And they were accusing her of being a Fed. They were accusing her of being an informant. Because every time that she had been arrested or, you know, questioned for anything, she was released shortly thereafter. Of course, from an outside perspective, people would think, oh, well, that sounds a little suspicious. But from someone who knows anything about international law, she was a Canadian citizen in the United States. And if they took her into custody, they would have had to have a reason to keep her there. And there would have had to been documents and all kinds of paperwork. It just doesn't happen like that. So she knew her rights, and she knew they didn't have a right to hold her. So she often walked right out of the courthouse or right out of the police station. And that made her suspect, because they all felt somehow that she must be sharing information, which we know she wasn't. And she promised, you know, at that time when she came, that she would call us at Christmas time. And she was always really particular in how she made sure she followed through on those promises. And I remember 3 specific things she told me. These were the last words that eventually I didn't know at the time would be the last words she spoke to me. The first thing she said was, don't lie. Whatever you do, always speak the truth. No matter what, speak the truth. And then she said, don't ever allow anyone to tell you that they are better than you. We are all created equal. We are all equals. And, you know, as a 9-year-old kid, you hear that, you're like, oh, okay, you know. And then the other one was to look after your sister. And I think that was the most poignant thing she said to me, because in my 9-year-old mind, I thought, well, why do I need to look after my sister unless it was to boss her around? And I relished that. But at the same time, knowing that stuff was serious, that it was getting serious. And I was aware of that. Didn't necessarily mean that I had to accept it, but I knew something wasn't quite right. So Christmas came and went, and we didn't hear anything back. And I think it was in March of that 1976 that my dad sat us down and told us, you know, the worst news any child can hear, that my mother was no longer living. He explained that they had found her on the side of the road. And he didn't give us details, but he said that she died fighting for her people and that she was a warrior. And that's all that he said to us. You know, at that time, we were just preparing to go away on a holiday, just down to the States for, I think it was Easter. And he asked us if we wanted to go to the funeral or if we wanted to go to, you know, our vacation. Of course, no child wants to go to their funeral, their parents' funeral. We didn't know where we were going. We would have to go by ourselves, you know, with people we didn't know. So of course we stayed to our safe space and we chose not to go to her funeral. But my aunties went to the funeral. And what happened during that time is probably, in hearing in retrospect now, one of the most telling validations of the betrayal that my mom had suffered within this group. My aunties were picked up at the airport to attend the funeral by people, I'm guessing, from within the American Indian movement. The drive from Rapid City to Pine Ridge is probably, or into Wombly and that area, is probably a good over 3 hours. It was, you know, in the middle of the winter, and there were guns and ammunition littered all over the floor of the van that they were picked up in. They were then questioned the whole time while they drove over those 2 to 3 hours about who they had spoken to. Had the FBI contacted them? What did my mother say to them the last time they saw her? Had they had communication with her? What was she saying? My aunties, being really, you know, aware and very suspect of being asked these questions, resorted immediately to speaking in their Mi'kmaq language together to communicate for the rest of the time they were there. They were not permitted to go into the tent to view her body. They were not allowed to attend anything that was within anything that they could view. They had to stay outside the tent during the funeral. Of course, they were allowed there, but they weren't allowed to touch the casket. They were reassured and told that she was buried, that they had cleaned her body, and that she had traditional clothing put on, and they were going to do a traditional burial. They wrapped her up in a blanket, and that's how she was laid out, and that they reassured my aunties that this was the case. So they go through that, they come back, they're heartbroken because, you know, they don't feel like they've done their sister any justice by going there. They really wanted to bring her home, but they do know that she had expressed to them in her life early on when she first joined the American Indian movement that if anything were ever to happen to her, that she would want her heart buried in Wounded Knee, that she would want to be buried there. And because that's where she felt that, you know, she was doing a lot of her work, and not just for that community, it was for Indigenous rights globally, and that just happened to be the epicenter at that time. You know, a lot of people will talk about, oh, your mom left you to your community or left your territory to go fight another fight. No, it was a fight for everyone. It wasn't just for them. That just happened to be where it was going on. She brought her traditional knowledge. Her moral and ethical code went with her there, and that's where it fell. You know, there was a lot of silence surrounding what happened after the funeral. My parents didn't talk about it. You know, I pretty much busied myself to just living my life, you know, and growing up for the next 15 years and getting married and having babies and, you know, and not really discussing a lot. But there was one opportunity I had in high school where there was a book that was written about my mom that I was not aware of. And we'll talk about that later, about what families go through with appropriation. And, you know, in the book was where I learned the details that she actually had been shot, and that she didn't just die of exposure or, you know, the vagueness of she just died. I got to learn, and I read the passages where by myself, without supports, without my parents knowing, under the blankets at night with my sister and a flashlight, to read what happened. And, you know, now knowing as an adult why my dad and my family didn't talk about that and tell us, it was to protect us, because to know that information at such a young age, I know would have had an incredible impact on my psyche, on my spirit. In also, I think, being able to develop a sense of ownership in myself and hope that I could bring change about. Knowing that when you lose that and you're disenfranchised at such a young age, which we know a lot of people go through in our communities and our circles, that was my salvation. That was my saving grace that my dad and my family offered us. You know, at the time, people, well, that wasn't right, they didn't tell you. And I'm like, oh, thank God they didn't tell me. You know, that was the way I managed to survive it. Learning it when I could process it as an adult, and learning that all of the hiccups and bumps and obstacles in our world, I was able to process that as an adult, not as a young child. And, you know, there was a lot of books, a lot of magazines, you know, that were written in articles, all of them filled with misinformation, all of them filled with one side, one bias, one American Indian movement lens that basically they claimed that the FBI shot her. And even in the book that was written, it was implied that the FBI had something to do with her death. So for 28 years, our family sat in limbo, waiting to find out what we had inklings, we had ideas based on what she told us, based on what other people had whispered to us. But of course, as anybody knows that's gone through any kind of judicial process, you don't get to in any way change that by hearsay. You have to have evidence. You have to have eyewitnesses. So in 1997, I think it was, finally, when things started to shift a little bit, I got a call from a person in my community that said there was a gentleman from Sedona, Arizona, that was trying to get hold of Annie Mae's daughters. So my sister and I called him up, and lo and behold, it was a long lost cousin. His name was Robert Pictou Branscombe, and his mom was my mom's first cousin. And he said that he was actually a member of Leonard Peltier's Legal Defense Offense Committee, and that they had been talking about Annie Mae. And he started, you know, they used to call my mother Annie Mae Aquash. They didn't have the Pictou attached to it. And it wasn't until he started doing research and saw her maiden name and realized the similarity with his name and was able to make the familial connection. And he called us to tell us that, you know, he'd been working down in the States and he had been hearing lots of whispers about grand juries that were being held on behalf of my mother's case. So at that time, not knowing we had any kind of power, in 1999, we petitioned AFN, the Assembly of First Nations in Canada here, and asked for help, and learned at the same time that they had actually signed a resolution for my mother, unbeknownst to us, which I was grateful for, but at the same time signed a resolution for Leonard Peltier. Now, Leonard Peltier, if you're not aware of what he had done, shortly after the Wounded Knee takeover in June of 1975, was part of something called the Oglala shootout, where 2 FBI agents were shot to death. Their bodies were riddled with over 100 bullets. They claimed 3 people went to trial. 2 of them claimed self-defense and were acquitted. The other one did not, which was Leonard. He took off running. They caught him in Canada, had to extradite him back to the United States, and then he stood trial and is now currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences. He is the martyr for Indian country, for the American Indian movement in terms of resistance and political resistance. But I know him in a different way, and I know his behavior to be in a different way. He was a very violent man and shoved a gun into my mother's mouth and interrogated her, not once but twice, when she was with the group before they executed her. So we were a little disturbed when we found out that AFN was actually had a resolution to support him. So we questioned them on the contradiction and said, you know, where does that leave us? And there were no answers. So we stepped away and we said, thank you, we're good. We don't need your help. I was not invested in getting help from advocates or groups who did not have my mother's well-being as their priority, even if they are stating that that's their mandate. I was not interested in being disappointed. I wasn't interested in the hypocrisy and the contradiction, that the message that sent to our communities and our First Nations. So it was shortly after that he must have heard that we were upset, and he sent me a letter, you know, stating that he loved my mom, that, you know, he was sorry what happened to her, that, you know, if our family would sign a letter of support for him, he would consider helping us. And that also that he didn't interrogate my mother. Despite what the rumors were, he didn't interrogate her. I said, okay, fine, whatever. I said, well, if you're really interested in helping us, then you'll tell us what happened to my mom and who was engaged in shooting her. And his response back to me was, I would not participate in incarcerating another Indigenous man. So that ship sailed. We let that go. In 2003, I got an invitation to go to San Francisco. As I mentioned, previously. My mother was well known in the United States. Lots of organizations and groups were using her as their poster child for whatever cause they had going on. And there was a women's group called the Indigenous Women's Network that worked with women globally, and they had award ceremonies every year, and it happened to be in San Francisco this year, and they invited my family to come to give away an award to a woman by the name of Neeloch Butler, who was dying at the time of cancer. And when we arrived, knowing that Neeloch knew my mom, knowing that other individuals there were John Trudell and Dino Butler, all main players within the American Indian movement. And I was eager to question them and ask them what they had to say about the suspicions of what was being said at that time with the grand juries. They had released 3 names, Arlo Looking Cloud, John Graham or John Boy Patton, and Theda Nelson Clark as being the 3 suspects in my mother's murder. No charges had been left, no arrests, but of course, Moccasin Telegraph and the rumor mill weighed heavy in informing Indian country on what was going on. When we arrived, there was a ceremony going on, and Neeloch had asked that, we before they closed the ceremony off for her, if there was anything else we wanted to ask, the official that was officiating the ceremony, we could ask that. And my auntie, who at the time, was very petite and stature, stood up to her full, height and said, "Yeah, I want to know what happened to my sister." And immediately John Trudell went running from the room. I was holding Dino's hand. He started crying. Neeloch Butler, who is, the patient, came in. She grabbed Dino. I looked at Dino. I said, "Is this true? Are these 3 individuals the ones that killed my mother?" And he started sobbing. And then it was gone. They were all gone with my aunt in a back room discussing things. And then, of course, she confirmed later that, yes, indeed, these 3 individuals were the ones that killed my mother. So that is how I found out that this was an inside job, that it was not the FBI that killed my mother, that it was members of the American Indian movement, and that they had intentionally lied for over 28 years to hide the fact and the truth that they had executed one of their own women. At the same time, in 2003, I was invited to work with Amnesty International on a program they had with their sisters, missing, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a report that they were working on addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And at the time, I was invested. I was excited to work with them. I thought it was great. Here we had a big entity. I worked 8 months with the individual that I was assigned to develop a profile for my mom, to profile 100 top missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases in Canada. And they had, 4-foot posters built of every woman, and they were traveling the country nationally to bring awareness of this. And I think it was literally a month after I finished doing this profile work that they made an arrest in my mother's case. And immediately when John Graham, who lived in Canada at the time, was arrested, Amnesty International wrote a letter of support for him, saying he decided he deserved to have a fair trial. They likened him to the botched extradition of Leonard Peltier, all information that was hearsay. There were no facts. Basically, expecting him to be railroaded, expecting him to be unjustly arrested and extradited and tried, and putting all of the things that could go bad in there to support him. I immediately wrote Alex Nev a letter and said, "This is unacceptable. I just spent 8 months doing a profile about my mother with you, and this, what are you going to?" He writes another letter saying that that both Annie Mae and John Graham deserved a fair trial and deserved justice. I could not engage any further. I again stepped away and said, "No, thank you." The value that my mother held in my life and in other people's lives, I would not disgrace that with a half-assed, hypocritical, contradictory level of support. I had to stand my ground and say, "No, I'm not going to do this." Of course, then you get labeled as the troublemaker. You get labeled as stuck in your trauma. You get labeled as, "Oh, you're not willing to work with people." No, I'm not willing to work on lies. truth is everything for these families. Speaking their truth unconditionally and not having any political interference is the priority for every missing and murdered Indigenous woman and girl. And, you know, we then, after that first initial arrest that happened, went into, as I mentioned earlier, 10 years of trials. There were 4 trials, 2 trials that resulted in convictions. John Graham was convicted of kidnapping, felony murder in 2010. Thelma Rios, who was an accessory who made the call to kidnap my mother from Denver to take her to Rapid City, where they then drove her to Wanblee, and where they executed her, pled guilty that yes, she got a phone call saying that they needed to take her out to take care of her, like taking out the trash. And then in 2008, Richard Vine Marshall, or Dickie Marshall, he's known, who actually was charged with providing the weapon that they used to kill my mom, who was out on parole on another murder, was acquitted. And the reason he was acquitted is that the jury could not determine without a doubt that the intent was to kill her when they provided the gun. Nobody knows that unless you're a mind reader, but that he walked. But the great thing about that is that it gave us the opportunity to share the evidence for a third time that did not in any way change or shift in its finiteness in who was the killer, who did it, who ordered it, who was involved. And then, of course, the first arrest we ever had was Arlo Looking-Cloud, who ended up being charged with first-degree murder and served 10 years. So after all of the trials, you know, I distinctly remember standing out in 2010 outside the courtroom. All of the lawyers are there and the district attorneys there and people that I'd become intimately, you know, engaged on a day-to-day basis talking about such an intimate part of my life. You know, they really became great supports for us, sadly, because there wasn't, NWAC at the time didn't exist. All these women's movements didn't exist. We had nothing. We went on our own dime. We went on our own volition. We supported ourselves. I had wonderful people in my lives, you know, elders who supported me from afar. My family, I had full wraparound support in my family. But I know this isn't the case with a lot of families. And, you know, I think one of the things that surprised me the most is you would think after all of that, that you could have peace, that you could sit back and relax and think, okay, it's over now, it's done. And I remember hugging one of the lawyers and he said, you must be so relieved it's all over. And I said, no, sadly, it's not over for me. And he said, what do you mean? He said, I said, now I have to go out into Indian country and I have to educate them on what happened. Because the indoctrination that happened over 28 years in circles within our communities who didn't have trust in authorities, who don't have trust in policing, who don't have trust in our legal system and our justice system, and rightly so, had been spoon-fed a lie for decades, for generations. It's generational now. I'm talking to kids that are, you know, 20 years old, 19 years old, that are saying these guys are great heroes. And I'm like, not so much. You need to go back and read what happened to Annie Mae. And then also, you know, challenging things like when groups like Amnesty are continuously every year promoting freedom and clemency for Leonard Peltier. I had to be engaged again to defend my mother. And, you know, understanding that there was a lot of unexplained deaths back then. There was a lot of appropriation, a lot of people putting their own narratives and their own spins on things without evidence, without facts, with hearsay and gossip. But my aha moment when I was going through all of this, my real, you know, solid grounding was when, you know, I started telling people the story and the things I would say, you know, well, we didn't have any contact with the American Indian movement. In all those years, the 28 years, not once did anybody ever call up their so-called friends, family, to see how they were doing. You know, and their claims that they were land and water defenders, they started switching over from human rights to start looking at land and water defending. And it was enough to show me when we were reading evidence and documents and autopsy reports that the big lie spiritually that they claimed they buried my mother traditionally. And when we decided to bring her home during this process, because we decided they no longer deserved to have her in their territory. She needed to come back to us. We needed her medicine. We needed her here. When we exhumed her, that she was not treated in a traditional way. She was buried naked in a plastic tarp. And to a family member that has, you know, wanted to believe the best of everyone, wanted to believe that she talks so highly of these people as being her friends, the level of betrayal that she lived and died under, I see that happen all the time in our world. I see the appropriation every day. I see, you know, social media campaigns out there to support, you know, MMIWG, and you have individuals who are with the American Indian movement who have the blood of innocence on their hands, and they're supporting the hypocrisy. The level of hypocrisy that I was witnessing was disturbing, and it rocked me to my soul. And it was then that shift happened, that I was no longer talking about my mother, that what I was talking about was this entity of MMIWG. And when, you know, people started doing the pre-inquiry work and they started calling families to the tables for consultations, and organizations would fly different families across the country. And it was because of my outspokenness, because of my truth speaking of what happened with Amnesty, AFN, all these organizations that, you know, pretty much in our opinion, didn't really have the capability of supporting us in the moral and ethical way we needed, that we were blacklisted and not invited to these circles and not invited to these conversations. And I was okay with that, because in my heart and my spirit, I knew we had done everything for my mom that we could do. And now to this day, thinking that I can sit back, you know, the National Inquiry has set and sunset, and we've got this wonderful report, you know, 231 calls to justice that are legal imperatives that I'll go into in a minute with my slideshow, and I know we're running tight on time. In understanding that this no longer is about one woman, it is about the intentional cultural genocide and oppression that our First Nations have lived through, and the result of that in how our women are dying at high numbers and being dismissed every single day. You know, I thought that after the National Inquiry, after sharing my truth, that this, and I don't think the words got out of my mouth when I look on the news and Perry Bellegarde from AFN is promoting clemency for Leonard Peltier. And I sent him an email. I had a conversation with him on the phone. He hung up on me, but there it is. He said he believed he was innocent. And I said, well, one thing that you might want to go do is read the trial transcripts of my mom's murder trial. And several individuals testified stating that he bragged about shooting those 2 FBI agents. Said that the MFer begged for his life, but I shot him anyways. And these are all truths that people, unless you are willing to go and do the research and really learn and educate yourself, you know, people hearing this story now for the first time will think, I never knew, I had no idea. Well, you couldn't, because it was hidden so. And then I think of how many other stories are out there like this, that they're not having their platform. They don't have a voice. They don't have the resources. They don't have the attention. And it should never be that way. It should never be that you only have value if you're, you know, if you have that certain status. It should be that everybody is treated equally, and that every single woman, girl, man, boy that dies in this country, that there is a national outcry. You know, I look at what happened with Mr. Floyd south of the border, and I look at what happened to that woman last week, and I'm angry, because this country should have erupted, but it didn't. And why? Because our women don't have value. Our women are not important in this country. There's no other way of saying it. No, it's not because Canadians are polite. They sure as hell can, you know, protest not getting their lobster. And they sure as hell can protest about not getting their Jell-O when the railroad, railroad lines are blocked down. So I think the biggest picture, to kind of wrap it up a little bit in my family's experience in being able to speak this, is that it's not just about a few corrupt individuals, because people can say, oh, not everybody's like that. It's okay, that was just your experience. Is that it's a much bigger entity that's based in systemic neglect, systemic abuse, systemic violence, and it includes our own communities. And I know a lot of people don't like to discuss that because, you're viewed as being divisionary and, a hater. I've been called every name in the book, and it has not shut me up yet. You get publicly attacked for daring to speak out, and for our family, I don't know what has happened spiritually for myself, but at one point I used to care. I used to worry about people's privilege. I used to think, oh, I don't want to upset anybody because then maybe they won't invite me to the table anymore. But people are dying every day. So that politeness has gone. I'm respectful. I'm hopeful. I am willing to work to get through this. It isn't about blaming people. It's about how do we come together to unpack this horrific event that's happening in our lifetime. I have a daughter. Hopefully one day we'll have grandchildren. I have a son. And to me, leaving a legacy to them of hope and not feeling like we have to accept a second-rate, existence based on our birthright because we were born Indigenous. My mother in many ways created kind of a monster when she told us to think of yourself as equals, because I do. I own myself in my space. I own my house because it's what I want to do, not because I feel that's where the government or someone told me I had to go and do. I do it because it is what I want to do. And I speak what I speak because it is what I know my mother would have done. I live her legacy now in knowing and understanding that her life and her voice was cut short, but the work that she was doing and the spirit that she carried, I see in so many women. The 2 years I worked with the National Inquiry, I spent hours and hours listening to family stories, and the similarities were literally, goosebump creating. I would just look at them and say, you're telling my mother's story. I would tell them my story. Same thing. That's what exactly happened to my daughter, my son, my auntie, my sister, my mother. And then understanding that these stories are the living legacy, and that, people will think this is an entity or a thing of the past, but it's not. It's living, breathing, taking lives every day, and needs to be discussed every single day and appreciated. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girl has to have the value, I believe, the same value that we give to Veterans Day or Remembrance Day. It should be a national holiday. It should have a status that, in understanding, it's not to be exclusive. It's not about including men and boys or excluding them. It's not about excluding other groups. It's about identifying and acknowledging that if we do not have healthy women, we can't have healthy families. And if we don't have healthy women, the only way to overcome that is to make sure that their value is reinstated, that they're able to reclaim their proper place through their own inherent rights. And I talked earlier about, some of the challenges we see every day and how I see little nuances here and there that people just kind of dismiss and say, oh, it's not a big deal. I see them. What happened down on that wharf in Digby, I watched grown men verbally abuse our Indigenous women for singing their songs and speaking their language. Nobody said anything about it. Even our own men, nobody said anything. That, to me, right there, is the systemic racism and issues that our women deal with every day. We are dismissed on all levels. if we're really going to decolonize the process in how we move forward together as allies and as First Nations, as Indigenous people across this continent, we have to really make sure that we understand that the inherent rights of Indigenous women have value and equity, and that we're not going to stop looking for that. And I believe that that is the way that we move forward. The passive racism we see every day, you know, the struggles that our women deal outside of community because of not being accepted, the poverty, the homelessness, you know. So where do we go from here? How do we work towards real transformative change? It happens by sessions like this, educating each other and understanding. You had to listen to my story to understand the humanity and the value of one woman's life, and then you multiply that by 4,000 in this country of other families who are missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, family members or survivors. And understanding that our women need to be nurtured and protected and treated with dignity and equity, and society as a whole understands that, you know, even in our own communities, that we can't be marginalized. And we've become so indoctrinated by colonialism that, you know, we don't even recognize when we are being dismissed. And I see that happen a lot. And, you know, I can be known as being a little bit raggedy in saying things. I wait for the appropriate moment. I don't insult anyone, but I will speak the truth. My recommendation to you all is read the report. Read the final report. The work has been done. There's 231 legal imperatives in there. Calls to justice, they're called. Legal imperatives mean that Canada has to implement them. They're legally bound to address it. And we made sure that was in there. Remembering to use the proper language when we're in mixed company. Don't sugarcoat it. Call it what it is. It's genocide. Say it. Use it. And yes, you as allies can say genocide. You're allowed. I give you permission. It's okay. Nobody's going to beat you down for it. Well, maybe, depends on where you are. But we need preventative measures, not reactive measures. And when I say that, I mean there's a lot of investment put in, as I said earlier, to deal with the symptom and not with preventing that symptom from happening. We shouldn't be having all these marches for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We shouldn't be having campaigns for awareness. We should be building shelters. We should be building better healthcare systems. We should be building better safe spaces, detox, mental wellness centers, youth and young folks activity centers, you know, so that we have that ability to be able to become self-sustaining ourselves. Biggest threat to the big machine, I call it, and it's not just about pointing fingers, about genocide, colonial genocide. The biggest threat to that is healthy Indigenous people. It is a multi-billion-dollar business. Our illness, our trauma, and it is something that I believe we as First Nations have the ability to change. There's risk in speaking the truth, and I acknowledge that. I know that some women can't say the things I say. They will be run out of their villages. And I speak to this because, and I don't ask permission to speak on anyone's behalf but myself, but I welcome to people always to reach out to me. It's not about the platform. It's not about getting on a soapbox and saying this. It's actually, it's easy to talk the talk. The challenge is to walk your talk. So you don't have to have, it's in the little things you do, just the little things. It all adds up And I have hope and belief that eventually that will be the shift that we need. I had a little bit of a platform here for, and I know we're running short on time. Someone give me a time check. I think we're probably looking at wrapping up here to allow for questions. And basically what it was is the PowerPoint I had was talking about the national inquiries and their mandate, and something that you all intelligent individuals can go and read. I'll have them attach it to this presentation, because I think it's important that you see exactly what I was talking about and the way that the national inquiry was set up in terms of addressing some of the issues that are big game changers in my view. And one of them is mental wellness. We're in the middle of a pandemic. As much as people like to feel safe in Nova Scotia, you know, it's all around us. We're just a sitting duck. It's a matter of time. It's coming back. We know that. Keeping our elders safe, keeping our community safe is priority. And there's a lot of stress and anxiety that comes with that. And I really believe that that should be the priority in making sure that our Indigenous populations are protected in this. I'm not interested in having false, I go with facts, I go with science, in understanding how these viruses work. And, you know, we fell for that once, so not gonna do it again. So I think that pretty much brings my presentation to a close. I wanna thank you all. I smile because I see Elder Jane's face here, and you know, she's my rock, she's my support. Some of the stuff that I spoke about today could have been disturbing to some people, and you may not have agreed with it, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. But if you want to discuss it further, then by all means, respectfully, you know, I will give my email out or contact info or whatever you need. You can find me on the good old Facebook, that's for sure. I'm there, you know, inbox me if you have any further questions. If you're too shy to ask it here, or if there isn't enough time, then I welcome any open discussion. And know that, you know, this work I do, yes, I do it for my mom, I do it for myself, for my aunties, for my elders, for my sisters and my mothers and my grandmothers, who are no longer living. But I will read you something, because one of the things I think that we dismiss a lot is the intergenerational impact that this has. And even in myself and the work that I did, I didn't realize how much of an impact it could have. So it's just a short little passage. And so when we went to trial, we had to write impact statements about the effect all of this had on us, and it's read during sentencing, so that, you know, somehow that, I don't know if it increases the time of, you know, sentencing or what it does, but we wrote how this emotionally, spiritually impacted us. And I was leaving, getting ready, rushing out the door to go to South Dakota for this hearing, for the sentencing. My daughter at the time, who was maybe 10 or 11, pretty much in the same age that I lost my mom, says, "Mom, can I write an impact statement?" And I said, "Okay, I guess, sure. What do you have to say?" She goes, "That's okay. You go catch your flight. I'll have Daddy email it to you." I said, "Okay, fine." So I get to my hotel room and I open this up, and this is what I read in the court. It says, "Victim impact statement. I know a victim impact statement is supposed to be about what you lost, but mine is about what I never had. I never met my grandmother. I still don't really know what she looks like or even smells like. I never even felt comfortable even saying her name until this past year. I also never met anyone who had a family member who was murdered. My grandmother is what a lot of people lost, but my grandmother is what I never had." And that was from her granddaughter. So there's lots of little eyes and ears listening to us as we talk in circles. There's lots of dismissal in how we think our youth are hearing and adjusting and processing the stuff that we're going through. And like I said, when I witnessed what happened down in the wharf in Saulnaville, I saw the racist comments on Facebook, I was impacted. And I'm not in that community. I wasn't down there fishing, but I was impacted because to me, it was a reminder of how we thought we had come so far, but really we hadn't. And now here's the push where we need to break through that and change the way things are done, because clearly what we thought was working is not, for people to have that attitude, you know. But that brings us to a close for that. Thank you, Mary Beth. And
Thank you. I know you asked for a time check.
No,
you
that's
asked for a
good.
time
Your
check.
face popping up there was great.
Okay. I have the same drinking glass that you have.
These are awesome. 18 hours cold.
Thank you so much, Denise, for sharing that your story. And I know it's difficult to share it over and over and over again, but there's still lots of people that haven't heard it. So I hope that the people that were listening today will learn and think differently, and perhaps go out and read the report of the final report of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry. There's a couple of questions that were coming in on the chat function, so I will read some of those to you. But first, I want to give Jane a chance to say something. If there's anything you want to say, Jane, or how are you feeling?
I'm okay. I always have so much admiration for Denise. I love her dearly, and I just want to thank her so much for sharing her story, for sharing her mother's story, and continuing to remind everybody how valuable we are as human beings, how valuable we are. Maloney, it's all.
Love you.
You too.
So Denise, so I don't know how much you know about our little group of people that are following along with these series. A lot of them are educators in Nova Scotia primarily, or are in education circles. And so one of the questions that came through, I mean, you said we should be doing lots of little things, and there's lots of little things that we can do each day to change our language and do things differently. I'm also thinking about what you said, you know, your family had to protect you when you were young from some of the stories that you didn't know where to put. So how do you have any suggestions about how we can make sure that we don't hide from these issues, that we talk about them, but that we also talk about them appropriately at different age levels or with different groups?
Yeah. Yes, it is important to be trauma informed. It is always important to be truthful, not to, in terms of, you know, censor what information needs to be shared, but details, you know, sometimes, as they say, you know, are to, in some place, emote emotion or emote a connection. You know, when you talk about residential schools, kids in primary need to hear about that. They need to hear, they hear every other historical, where you are sharing Canadian history of any level that's appropriate, that's when you would put that in there. Do they need to hear the stories of people? No. They may be able to hear it through a child's perspective of not, you know, being taken away from their home. There's actually an exercise I do with school age kids to help them be able to empathize with what the experience was like to be taken from your house. You know, and it's just going through a scenario in a very, very basic way of think about losing everything that you have, you know, overnight, where someone comes and takes you away. It's a reality that happens every day, even to our kids through, you know, other forms of child services. But, you know, that's another discussion. But what I think is important is not to censor ourselves so much in terms of educating our children, because I know my daughter educates me every day, just in the language, you know, in how I talk. She sometimes has to check me and say, "Mom, we don't say that anymore." I'm like 1970s, right? Like 70s and 80s. It's the silly things that come into my mouth. I'm like, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. But, you know, it's about learning always. So information that you share with a child in elementary school, they're going home and they're talking about it with mom and dad who may not have that information. So, you know, and it can be done in a safe way. And there's experts who are mandated to do that. But one thing I do want to say that I think that, and I didn't get to address it too much, is that one thing, and I know I talked to you guys that were organizing this thing, is try not to rely too much on having, it's great to have elders in, it's great to have people to speak to their experience like I did today, but make sure it's done in a safe way. Make sure that everybody is on board with how you're doing that, and don't go through the process of having a speaker in, because they're speaking about atrocities that have been imposed on them by a society that is now expecting us to educate them on their own crimes. So when you think about it in that context, you want to make sure that they're brought in to validate, not to teach. So educators are perfectly capable of sharing that information and doing it in a safe way. We know there's children in our schools that identify as Indigenous that don't necessarily are visible minorities, so we want to make sure that we're careful to protect them. And that's done just through education. And it's done through having honest conversations about some of the content that you're going to be sharing. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I say that as well. It's hard for some reason to make it resonate with people, but there's always the question, how do we contact elders? How do we bring elders in? And it's really a question of, are the elders the appropriate people to be teaching that right now? Or are there other experts that maybe you don't think of as elders, but they're knowledge holders and they're trained? And so we can try and bring some people in who are able to speak to.
Well, and when you're doing this work, you should always have an elder there, because you're talking about sacredness. The elders are our knowledge keepers and what is sacred and what is safe in our communities. And they should be there as the support, not necessarily to educate, where the educators are thinking, okay, well, I don't want to talk about that because it's uncomfortable, so I'll bring in the speaker to talk about it. You're talking about, you know, stuff that's still going on, that people are still living that trauma. And I'm not saying that there aren't people out there capable to do it. There are. So by all means, still do the speakers, but it has to be used in a different context and in a different way, as a supportive role as opposed to the main educator.
Right. Thank you. Another question from this group that we get all the time, if there are resources or books that you think people should be reading or could be reading, they would love to have them. We would love to share them.
Okay. So I'm laughing, sorry, I'm grinning, because that was one thing I really never got into depth with during our talk, was the appropriation of anime Pictou. There's many books out there written about my mom. There's many articles. There's even some movies. I think there's maybe been one book and one documentary that's actually correct with the proper information. Everybody else has written their own narrative. So it can be very confusing to people. And they say, oh, I saw a movie about your mom. It said that she was killed by the FBI. And I'm like, when was the movie made? Oh, in 1976. And I'm like, oh, well, in 2010, we had a trial. So that's no longer true. So it's just, you know, contact me. There is a book, and it's heavy reading, and it's called American Indian Mafia. And the reason I don't talk a lot about it is because it's over 1,000 pages, and it talks about the J. Edgar Hoover FBI and that era. But what they do get right is what happened to my mom, because they had the wherewithal to contact our family and they attended the trials. So to an outsider reading the book, it looks very self-serving for the FBI, but the facts in there about my mom are dead on, spot on. Doesn't in any way herald the FBI as heroes, but it does talk, if you wanted to go and get that book or rent it out from the library or whatever and read those excerpts in there, they are dead on with the information because it came straight from us. And then Catherine Martin's film, oh my God, that she did with the National Film Board about my mom is very spot on about her life. Unfortunately, it was produced right before we went to trials. So even though we knew the information, because we were just going into trial, we couldn't divulge any of that for fear of compromising the integrity of the trial. So we hinted heavily in that documentary, but we could not, unfortunately, speak to it. So it's not accurate and up to date with what happened since then. And that film was put out in 2003 or 4, I believe, that was released. So literally right before we went to trial. So, but it is good to get the context of what happened to her in her days, and really a great way to memorialize her in who she was, because my mother was much more than dying in, you know, South Dakota. She had a whole life before that, even though it was short. She did have a very full life, and those who knew her talk about that regularly, about how full she lived her life.
Great, thank you. Jane, were you going to say something? I saw you. Now that I can see you on video this time around. No, okay.
I usually have a lot to say, but today I'm just, I don't know what I can add. I really don't. And I just have such great admiration for Denise and for her aunts. I know her aunts, and for that family. And that's really all I can say, that they've been strong, but still remained kind to the rest of us. She's a beautiful soul, Denise, and I've had the privilege of knowing her for a while, and just very grateful that she presented today. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful as well. And I'm watching the chat questions that are coming in. There's less questions and more just gratitude. So many things that you said are obviously resonating with people, and they want you to know that they really appreciate you telling your story in this way and for sharing. And I'm not seeing questions coming in. And I'm not having too many questions either, because it's such a big thing to think about. I teach business at the university, Cape Breton University. And so I'm always thinking about, how is this relevant? I mean, how do I make this relevant to students in the business classes, and thinking about law and justice and how that impacts how
Do
we
you talk
operate.
about land extraction?
I do.
Then that's how you talk about this.
I
don't mean
do.
to laugh it off, but listen, I know where you're coming from, because people have. I had a biology teacher that came to me once and said, I really loved your presentation that you did, and I think it was on, I can't remember what it was on, October 1st or something like that, Treaty Day. And he goes, I'm just trying to find ways of bringing you into my biology class. How can I bring you into my biology class? I said, well, do you study plants? I said, we have a whole traditional medicine component that you can engage your students in. I said, and that's how they learn, and that's how they get engaged, is doing things. And I can find pretty much any way to connect Indigenous values and livelihood, and even our women and missing and murdered Indigenous women in some way or form. There's always a way of connecting it, and not like far-reaching, connecting. I mean, real, honest to goodness. People will be able to empathize connections. Because that's what we're lacking right now. I really believe that we've become so immune to all of the violence and all of the overwhelming busyness of our life and our society right now, that it is really, even for myself at times, we've built up a callousness. And then until you're directly connected to it, then it hits home that this is for real. It's not just this thing called #MMIWG, that it actually, I mean, each and every woman I know of that is Indigenous across this country knows someone. I don't know anybody that doesn't know anyone that has not been affected by this in some way or form.
Yeah. And the point that you made, oh, go ahead, Jane, were you going to say something?
No, that's okay. Finish off, Mary Beth.
Oh, I was just going to say, I do bring up the concept of land, because at CBU we talk about community economic development. And I've learned recently in the last couple of years that we're a business school that talks about the economics of the capitalist system, not just, you know, the money that's coming in and going out, but where does the value of money come from? And so we do talk about land, or we used to anyhow, talk about land and how so much of the economic value that we exchange is connected to land ownership and land tenure. And I guess my other question would be, you talked about George Floyd and what's happening in the States in response to his death. And that brings up a lot of questions, at least in business schools, around gender and diversity in organizations. And how do we make sure that we're respecting gender and diversity, and also is there a difference between gender and diversity support and Indigenous supports, and what are some of those differences? So I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
Well, what I know, of course, we talk about gender in Indigenous circles because we have several. We have more than than most have, and it's been something that we've had our whole lives. You know, when you're talking about diversity, and are you talking about bringing them to the table, bringing them into hiring? And here's the thing that I think is our biggest obstacle with Indigenous people in coming into businesses, and they're saying, well, we want to be more gender diverse, we want to be more culturally diverse, we want to hire more people so that we have visuals, we have people that are at the table. And that's great to say, but when you consider that historically, most Indigenous people have not had opportunity to get the training and the resources needed to sit at those tables. It's all great an idea, but if you're not willing to do the development that needs to happen to make that field equal, and a lot of it has to be simplified by, as we do with a lot of, you know, employment opportunities where there's Indigenous people, that they say that they give life experience value. We have knowledge keepers who are equal to the highest levels of PhDs in our circles, but because they don't have that paper, they're not valued. Amongst us, they are. When we talk about knowledge keeper, Jane Meters, and oh, that woman is like got 10 doctorates in my eyes. And that has to do with the cultural language. It has to do with the value and how we decolonize this process. Is that if you can't look at things in different lenses, and I think you spoke to it last week with two-eyed seeing, that here's the Western concept, what's the Indigenous concept? This is it. We have life value, we have lived experience. That's our PhD paper, you know, and if they're able to speak to it and they do the research and the study, I say this now, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I don't have a degree. I have my grade 12, and I have about maybe 4 years of microbiology and psychology training, you know, but I never finished my degree because raising my children was my priority at that time, and then I just got tired. and sadly, the trial took up a good 15 years of my life when I would have probably worked on my education. And then after all of that work, I needed to have a rest and just be and do the work that I'm doing now, which is where my heart is and my spirit is. And I see more value in that for me, in terms of moving my mother's legacy and living my best life that way. So I think that if you want to talk about diversity, the structure and how businesses do that has to be changed, has to be decolonized. So if you're going to expect people to come to that table, then you have to expect. And I believe the term, and correct me if I'm wrong, is cultural, I want to say, it's not pedagogy, but understanding that culturally everybody has different ways of coming to the table and values. So
yeah. Well, I was looking at, when I was reading your bio the first time around, I was like, well, you have so much background in so many things. you do have a degree. You probably, whether they give you the paper or not. And now you probably also have a degree in law and social advocacy that
I do, but I
unfortunately.
don't have the understanding in terms of understanding things. I'm very, I call myself basic human, Indigenous, inherent rights based, because when you start talking about all the jargon and why this has to be and this has that's all, that makes no sense to me. If the value of life isn't there, then you can make all the excuses you want. You can protest all you want. You can for the next 7 generations. But if we're not taking efforts to make sure that the base core, which is our women and their inherent rights and their value and space in our communities, then everything else falls apart, as we see right now in our societies. You know, there's no other way of putting it. There's a saying that says that, you know, when I believe when another country or another entity wants to take over a country, all they need to do is go after the women, you know, that when the women's hearts are on the ground, then they have been successful. And that's where we're at. We need to pull those back up.
Agreed.
Jane, I know you wanted to say something.
No, it's just that as you were talking, and that's one of the things too, that there's a group of us women who are trying to push that and bring women forward and bring women's leadership forward in the home and everywhere else, in the workplace and in our communities. And we call ourselves Wabanagiga, we squawk the women of First Light, and my daughter is Paulina. Well, you know Paulina. Right now she's organizing a weekend in Tadmagush, and some of it will be online. But it's about bringing those women together and about our traditional leadership. And no, you're so right. One of the things that there's a lot of lateral violence, not just out there, but inside our community.
Yep.
There's lateral violence, and a lot of it comes from leadership. You know, I know nobody's going to like what I have to say, but it's got to be said. You know, and there are places in our communities that sometimes I don't understand. Like some of the things sometimes our leaders talk about is they tell our young people, go out, get educated. My father told me that. Go out, get educated, come back, work for your people. You'll have a job working for your people. Dedicate your life to working for your people. And then what happens to a lot of our young people, they go out, they get their education, they come back, they apply for jobs here, and suddenly they're not good enough. They're not good enough for some reason. I think a lot of our own people seem to think that if it's that colonial mentality again, it's that colonized heart, that colonized spirit, that colonized mind, that I will never be good enough, or that our people are not good enough. They may be more educated, they may have more knowledge, but they won't get the jobs, even in our community. They might get a job doing something else, like labor, but they're not going to get the jobs in high position, as much education as they have. And Denise, I want to tell you something. With me on my CV, the education that I list at the very top, the most important education in my life, I have teachings from the elders. When it says time of graduation, it says lifelong. And that is my most important education. If I don't have that, I have nothing else at all. And I know you have that too.
Yep. I love it. It's my diploma.
Yeah, that's
my
right.
elder's
That's
diploma.
My daughter writes that now on her school.
I love it. It's great.
Important.
You know,
because
I'll say
we need to value that.
Yeah. you hit on something there, Jane, that you reminded me of that, and I'm again watching the time, and if there's no other questions, then I'll say this. And this is me again being raggedy ass, and I should never have to say that I have to be raggedy ass. I should feel safe enough to say this anyways. You know, the systemic issues that we see in our communities are there for a reason. It benefits no one but the person holding the purse strings. Having First Nations, Indigenous populations in any continent in constant survival state is intentional, because if you have a group of people that are always in survival mode, always dependent, the will and the knowledge and the strength to be able to overcome that becomes cyclical, and they go to the overpowering body to get the help. The help is less than sustainable, so that they always have to go back, and the cycle continues. My hope and goal, and Jane, I know of your group, and I've been watching you guys eagerly from the sidelines. I'm just so busy, I can never attend any of your workshop. But I know that we share the same wishes and the same hopes for the future, that we're able to break that cycle, that we're able to become, don't wait for the solution to come from people who are invested in maintaining that cycle. You're not going to get the solution. You have to come up with what you guys are doing is incredibly empowering and important, because this is how we dignify our women's value in our place, is by educating each other that we are valued and we are important and that we matter, and that yes, lateral violence is a thing and needs to be addressed, and that is a colonial construct, the jealousy and the crabs in the bucket mentality and the pulling each other down. You know, I censored myself a lot when I first started speaking about my mom, because people were asking me, well, who are you? You know, what right do you have to speak on MMIWG? Thinking, well, I am a family member. I think I have a right and I'm taking it. So it's about knowing and being aware of your own value and carrying that. And on days where it's bad and you're feeling like you're falling and stumbling, you go to your sisters for support. You go to your elders, you know, and you say, I'm having a bad day. Being up here all the time and, you know, raging against the machine, it's designed to break us down. It's designed to exhaust us. I have days where I just like, I just can't. But then I go to sleep, probably eat some chocolate. And then I wake up the next day and I'm ready to go again. But it's acknowledging that we all have that. It's not about being the warrior and strong all the time. It's that insistent, persistent, willful knowledge that we are moving forward on our terms. That's going to be a game changer. And it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. You don't need their acknowledgement or their acceptance. That they can't take that from you. That's part of our inherent right.
Some wise words to end on, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Hi,
Thank
Nicole.
you.
Hi, everyone. Wow, Denise, thank you so much. Your story of warriorship, survivorship, your resilience, this entire time that you've shared with us has been a true gift. It's truly eye and heart opening. Thank you for sharing your light and shining a light on your mother's life. I hear a strong call to action to read the final report of the MMIWG, and we've provided a link for that, and we will follow up. Everyone who's on this call, you will receive a resource document with a direct link there. Denise, I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but I feel like listening to your talk today, I feel like I'm holding some of yours and some of your mom's raggedy-assed energy. Some of what I heard you saying in terms of a call to action, and this is just a little bit of a summary of what I was taking in, because there's so much, and I'll be going back over this recorded webinar a number of times. But a number of the things that I heard you say that your mom said to you, as one example, is to always be truthful. And for us to embrace that, and to help for us as allies on this journey, to expect and help create a society that truly ensures that Indigenous people are treated equally. And that includes women being respected, protected, treated with dignity and equity, and for us to speak up and to speak out around microaggressions, full aggressive behavior and language, and lateral violence by those in positions of power. I also heard you saying that part of our role is to help build the systems to ensure healthy, empowered, and valued Indigenous people and communities. And as you said, this empowerment is the biggest threat to the colonial genocide that is still occurring in Canada and worldwide. I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart, Denise. This was
Thank you.
an incredible time and gift that we got to spend with you today, and with Elder Jane Meader. So much respect and gratitude for both of you, and to you, Mary Beth. So thank you all. And I'll give the floor back over in a moment, but I do have a couple of housekeeping things. You'll receive an invitation for the survey, as you're probably all very familiar with now. We do appreciate your feedback. If you could take a couple of moments to do that. Next Tuesday on October the 20th is our 5th session in this series 2, and we'll be welcoming Senator Dan Christmas. I believe he'll be joining us from Ottawa, and he'll be returning to turn our attention back to residential schools and a discussion on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the fundamentals of what he believes need to be addressed as we move forward as a nation. We'll then be taking a 2-week break and coming back with Series 3. We'll have 3 to 4 sessions. They are currently being confirmed and still designed. And the focus on Series 3 is around Mi'kmaq governance, education, language, and social challenges. And this series is due to end around early December. And in the new year, we'll be coming back for Series 4. And that's when we start to shift. And Denise, you're already helping us with this shift in calls to action around what we can do as individuals, what we can do as a nonprofit sector, for people that are willing and ready to do this work and to do the deep inner and outer work, so that the conversation will shift to incorporating reconciliation learning into our work and our everyday lives. So as we mentioned at the top of this webinar today, we do have a document that is available. Actually, if you click on it now, it'll show up in your browser, and it has a listing of various support services if you need to call on anyone for further support after today's session. So as always, I want to turn the floor back over to Mary Beth, to Denise, and finally to Jane for closing remarks and to close this very sacred time.
Okay, well, I guess I can go first and just echo what Nicole has said. We are so very, very grateful that you are willing to come on and join in this conversation, both Denise and Jane. It's I hope this is an effective forum at helping people to navigate some of the complexities of working on reconciliation and understanding how difficult that job is going to be. Denise, when you were talking, I was thinking about how like these are very controversial topics, but as Indigenous peoples working in this field and another field, any field really, you can't avoid controversial topics, right? You're always going to encounter them, and so we have to have to be able to do that in a way that's respectful and honest. And so I sincerely appreciate you sharing your story with us and sharing your family's story with us.
Thank you. And just to further make that point, I don't think it as controversial when there's lives being involved. Controversy, you know, is politics. It's whether you believe in one thing, there's evidence to support two things. This is finite. Death is finite. Survivorship, once someone survives an attack of violence, is finite. It's not an illusion. It is something that is black and white in my eyes. And I think one of our biggest challenges, and it's not because you used the words controversy, you just reminded me of it. When we first came out of the gates, people kept saying, oh, well, your mom's story is so controversial. I'm like, tell me how. Tell me how it's controversial. She lost her life. That should be enough. That's it. That's it to value her. And again, Mary Beth, you just brought up that topic because, and it's important because that is how we view things that aren't controversial, is that we don't know how to manage ourselves in unpacking the severity and the reality of the trauma, and the issue is so overwhelming that it's easier if we controverse it, you know. Oh, it's controversial, you know, like, oh, it's a bad controversy. To me, people are trying to argue over the value of it, and there's no argument in my eyes. And I know Jane will agree that this is where we have to decolonize our language that we use around the subject matter. It's not controversial. It's actually life and death, and it's pretty. There's a line, you know. You're not almost dead. You are dead. You're not almost alive. You're alive. So, mad love to you all. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I've gotten really comfortable using webinars and all this stuff. Thankfully, it's been a while. So if you'd asked me 6 months if I wanted to do this, I would have said, oh, I don't know. But after being on this almost every day with work, I want to thank you for your opportunity. It means a lot to me to share this story.
Jane, the last word goes to you.
I think I just want to kind of reiterate what Denise said, that, you know, all these things in our lives as Indigenous people, I don't think that there are too many Indigenous people you'll run across that have not been affected by a woman who has passed away in their lives through murder or because they're missing. There's people that every one of us know somebody or love somebody who's been in residential school, whether it's aunties, siblings, parents, grandparents. And then again, the high suicide rate. All of us have been affected by suicide, whether it's a friend or a sibling or somebody in our families, the next door neighbor. Sexual assaults. There's so much each and every one of us have. I think every one of us carry. When you compare it to Western society in Canada, not everybody carries that, but in Indigenous populations, everybody carries those things. Know somebody that has been affected. And I think that's where, like Denise said, we really need to look further for that healing, not just for ourselves, but for others too, and for all our people, and that we need to understand, and you know, Denise is talking about, we need to, and I say that every week, we need to walk hand in hand and find that reconciliation. We need to reconcile. There's this guy I listened to, his name is oh my gosh, I can't even remember his name right now. It's so funny. He's a Navajo speaker, and he talks about reconciliation. He said, how can we reconcile when we didn't have that relationship in the first place? He said,
Yep.
Yeah, we need to come together and bring that, you know, because historically, you know, we've been we've always been on the, I don't know how to say that, but not on the positive end of that relationship. And you know, when Denise was talking to, and I say that about our treaties, and I've said it over and over, one, that our treaties, first of all, it's the English conceded to the terms of our treaties. It's our ancestors that laid out the terms of those treaties. And it was our ancestors who were in a position of power when those treaties were written out. And I think we need to change the narrative of that, because people tend to assume it was the British who gave us those rights. It was us who allowed the British and the British heirs to live in our lands. And it was us who kept our ancestors who kept those rights for us, for the generations coming, because that's what they had, and that was what was given to them through our Creator, and they kept it. So it wasn't the benevolence of the British who gave us those rights. So anyway, I think I said, but yes, that it was the British who conceded to our terms, and it's not us who were we were in the position of power, and we need to take, like Denise said, we need to take on that sovereignty and say, hey, we still are, you know, we still live on this land. We are still part of this land, and that land is part of us. So thank you. Love to all of you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.